Guess what Perez Hilton found this article? This interview between Megan Twohey of the New York Times and NPR. And I am shocked at this discovery. I don't know if he found it or if someone sent it to him, but many of us missed this. And it has Megan in an interview actually talking about speaking directly to Blake now, whether or not that matters, because Justin's case for defamation was dismissed. What is interesting in this article is not so much about what he did to her, not so much about the misconduct on the set, not so much the esh that made everything so big that made him get dropped by Ari Emanuel in WME, which made an award be rescinded from him, which made him become, mostly a pariah. Instead, the article focuses on the smear campaign. Right? The smear campaign with Megan, recalling a conversation she had with Blake, noting that what she experienced on set wasn't even that bad. If it wasn't even that bad, why are you suing? Oh yeah, it's Blake Lively. We all know here that we started off all of our investigations very objectively. We try our best to look at both sides, but the case is very heavily skewed against Blake at this point, with very frivolous claims and a smear campaign that appears non-existent, and who actually appears to be involving herself in a smear campaign is none other than Blake Lively. And I want to talk with you about what's happening on Reddit, because something's going on in one of their subreddits. It ends with lawsuits and how it got taken over by bots of Stephanie Jones, people like sympathizing with her and sympathizers of Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. And that happened almost immediately following the dismissal of Justin's lawsuit. And now it appears that there is a smear campaign and some sort of digital manipulation happening on Reddit, trying to shift the narrative in on Reddit about Baldoni and trying to get people to view Blake as the victim. A campaign that she accused him of doing to her is now being waged against Justin. There's a lot of irony here, but the article is from December 23rd, 2024, and it's between NPR's All Things Considered, and it's Ari Shapiro, a journalist, and Megan Twohey. And this article is mostly about the smear campaign. She was asked about the text messages and emails that Blake Lively's team obtained through a subpoena. The subpoena is Vanzan Inc., the false subpoena, the fake subpoena. So New York Times was representing this as a valid lawsuit, and honestly, I think that Blake might have lied to New York Times. I feel like maybe the New York Times they were negligent in that they didn't do their due diligence, and they just went off the surface and took what they were given by Blake at face value. But some of her responses here make me feel like she was believing what she was being sold by them. She said, "It's remarkable to be able to go behind the scenes and see what these people were discussing in real time as they put into motion a plan that she describes as retaliation for complaining during the filming of what she says was SH and other misconduct by Baldoni and the director, and also Jamie Heath, the lead producer. And at the time she complained during the filming, they had agreed to put in place a full-time intimacy coordinator, bring in an outside producer, and put in place other safeguards that she was seeking. They also agreed at the time that they would not retaliate against her for raising these concerns and seeking the protections. But as the release of the movie was approaching, the men became increasingly worried that somehow her allegations were going to become public and taint them. And so they retained this crisis PR manager, a woman named Melissa Nathan. And the goal of the campaign that they set into motion was to harm Miss Lively's reputation. Instead, now she gave this interview before we had any evidence yet. From Justin Baldoni, we know today that prior to him retaining Melissa Nathan and putting anything into motion, Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds were making Justin Baldwin's life a living hell and terrorizing him by calling him a predator, demanding he not show up at the premiere. There was a phone call allegedly between Brian Reynolds and Justin where he told him that he knew people who could F him up. Allegedly, that's what a source told me. Don't quote me. Don't sue me. Brian, I heard you went all Deadpool on Justin, but what I think is odd is that she at face value says that she believes that Blake, this retaliation campaign just came out of nowhere, or that he hired her out of nowhere because they were somehow worried that it was going to get out. I wondered if there was any due diligence on the side of Megan while she was interviewing Blake, if she asked Blake, well, why would he have thought that was there something happening? Had you let him know that something was coming? Blake played dumb. She played dumb to Megan, and she admits this. Megan goes on to describe this quote-unquote smear campaign and speaks a bit as though it's fact. And I think the problem here with giving interviews when you are in a supposed to be an objective journalist, someone that is seeking truth. The goal of journalism, at least for the New York Times, is to not have a bias and to not take a position. Most journalists that cover mainstream journalism, they don't have time to investigate. They are simply regurgitating what is said to them. So they are supposed to show both sides. But the New York Times really didn't do that with this, and they had a bias right off the bat. And you know what? Bias is fine, but you need to tell your audience, the person reading that, you have a bias. Y'all know I'm biased. Bias based on facts, but she says, as though it's fact that they talk about starting threads online and doing other things to basically shift the narrative and what people are consuming on the internet. So they were under the impression Megan was an option that was provided of 2 digital options that were provided to Justin. One included a full digital team that would start threads online and try to interact with people to shift the narrative, but that's not the digital campaign or group that he paid for. Instead, they opted for a more passive approach where they would engage with people that left negative comments and try to just shift them away from the negativity, not introduce new theories, but get people on topic and staying on track. That was what the goal was. So then they asked, how of Melissa Nathan? How did she respond to the reporting? And she said, it's important to note that we sought comment from everyone who is named in the legal complaint that she has filed, and they haven't spoken to the underlying allegations of misconduct that she made during the shooting of the film, but they have denied that they engaged in any sort of retaliation or smear campaign, and have actually said they were just responding to negative information that she was planting and spreading, but she denies that she did anything, or that she or any of the representatives did anything along those lines. And they haven't produced any evidence of that. Well, they have now, because this was December 23rd, and now we know that Leslie Sloan was planting negative stories, and she was running around to the Daily Mail, and to Page 6, and to TMZ, and to People Magazine, and US Weekly, and Hollywood Reporter, and to Deadline. Basically anyone that would listen to her, and giving them exclusives, which were spreading false stories about Justin and painting him as a bad person. It really upsets me that Leslie's out of this case, because she is so much a part of the problem, and it makes me sad that the judge would not allow Justin to show or prove malice, because I truly believe in this case, malice was a factor, and I truly believe that the dismissal with prejudice and not allowing him the opportunity to go through discovery to prove the theories of malice, and that it was made based on, in the motion to dismiss and granting it, he decided that no malice took place. That kind of upsets me because it feels like there was so much malice, and there continues to be so much malice. They also point out that Baldoni was an advocate for women and that he escaped any harm because of the tide they shifted or because of what they did with the smear campaign, and that Blake suffered the biggest hit to her reputation. But it's interesting because Megan doesn't discuss why she was getting negative attention. Why were people talking about her in Megan's article? She incorrectly links Shea Stiflaw's interview from 2016 as a part of the smear campaign and suggests that Shea Sti put this out because of her ties to Melissa Nathan, which are none. And they didn't even correct it. They didn't even reach out to her to find out if she did any. Before she even accused Shasti of doing any of this, she never reached out to her and said, "Did you do this? Are you connected to Melissa?" Nothing. And Megan seems more interested because she says it shines a light on the new playbook on how to manipulate public opinion and public perceptions of a Hollywood star. And it brings into question to what extent these kinds of tactics are being used for other public figures to influence the way that we view a variety of things. She didn't even consider, are Blake and Ryan engaging in this? You know, one thing that you're supposed to do when you're a journalist and you're speaking to sources and you're getting information and sourced information is you're supposed to think about who your source is. What could their possible motive be for bringing you the information, right? So you're supposed to be objective when you deal with a source. Are they angry? Do they have a vendetta? Is there a material motive? Are they after money? Are they looking to hurt someone? Are they out for revenge? you also need to source the veracity of the claims and line that up against actual evidence. And in this case, all she went off of was a legal complaint without any evidence from Baldon's side. And it's my feeling that if you're going to make a claim like this, you should have all sides represented and at least give them more than 24 hours notice, right? She was proud that he was dropped from WME and he lost an award. I mean, she was glad to hear that, glad. And she says, and so Shapiro asks Megan. And it's not just the mechanics of how this machine operates, but also it's spraying from the allegations of sexual harassment, and it's entirely grounded in a gender imbalance on set Blake. Lively alleges, and Twohey says, yes, that's exactly right. She told me, Blake. She told me, like, listen, this was actually not the worst I've ever experienced in Hollywood. I've actually experienced far worse misconduct. This actually was not the worst I've ever experienced in Hollywood. I've actually experienced far worse misconduct. You know, I spoke up because I wanted to address it, and I thought that I had and never had any intention of discussing this or going public with my accusations. And so to watch what happened next and to experience what she's now alleging was this complete campaign of retaliation felt in many ways much more sinister than the underlying misconduct. And, you know, it's really interesting to watch in these messages, like Melissa Nathan, the person who led this campaign as though it's a fact, was me messaging with another one of the publicists, and they were kind of remarking in their success and how much the conversation was shifting online and how much backlash there was to Blake in the midst of this. And all she said, you know, it's remarkable because it shows that people really want to hate on women. And I think it's one of those moments where it really felt like they're yet another sort of playbook to harm people who come forward with allegations of misconduct. Okay, first of all, Blake told Megan is on this interview saying, this actually was not the worst I've experienced. That's what Blake said. I've actually experienced far worse. It's worse that I got smeared. Really, Blake, you've been playing the victim here for how many months, saying that you speak for all women, and you said it wasn't really that bad. It's actually so insulting to victims of domestic violence and of any sort of sex crime that you've amplified this story not because you were a victim of misconduct, but because you're a victim of an alleged smear campaign. And I think what really shocks me is just the lack of follow-up with the other side. I worked on a documentary for 2 years on Netflix, and we spent years trying to get the other side to come on camera. They were given opportunity, letters were sent to them, they were allowed to comment, they were allowed to share their side, they declined. But the opportunity was made over and over and over, and it wasn't made at the 10th hour, right before we were putting out the series. Legally speaking and ethically speaking, you would want to have the other side, because in the gaps here it would be, well, why was he do what he did? And Megan says, well, they told us they were just responding to the negativity that she was putting out there about us. And that's what the evidence shows. When I uncovered the Vanzan Inc. lawsuit, I remember specifically reading through the subtext and the boilerplate legal jargon, and I remember reading all of the lines and everything in there was about a third party putting out confidential information about me or my company that harmed my reputation. Someone I know going out of their way to harm my reputation and leaking information about me. There were 2 parallel things happening when the film was released. Social media was responding very loudly to the way that Blake was acting on the promotional tour. Blake was promoting alcoholic beverages in interviews with news agencies. There was an interview where a news reporter from New York actually was drinking a can of her Betty booze and talking about all of the flavors. While discussing a film about domestic violence, Blake at the premiere party created drinks in the names of the characters, including one of the abuser called Ryu Weight Fitting, since Justin sat in a basement waiting to watch his own movie during the premiere. Wayfair paid for that premiere and was not allowed that premiere party and was not allowed to attend it. Think about that. And they were reacting to her flippant comments when one reporter asks her about, what would you say to someone who is a victim that wants to have a conversation with you about, like, how do they reach out to you? How do they contact you? Which I thought was a strange question, but either way, she said, what do you mean, like low location share, like GPS, they want to know where I'm at? And it was just so flippant, so awful. Or constantly saying, This is not a film about domestic violence, or talking about her obsession with rings, or throwing in Taylor Swift, or cutting people off talking in word salad. Routinely not wanting to talk about the elephant in the room, that it was a film about generational trauma and domestic violence, and instead wanted people to believe it was a Barbie movie and a rom-com. That's what the response was on social media, and that came from the fans of the book that 10 million plus in book talk on TikTok, who were outraged. That was organic. It had been happening the entire time, and a lot of it originated in Colleen Hoover's own Facebook group that has over 200,000 followers and members in that group. It was a massive conversation in that group, and people were very upset. Melissa Nathan and Jennel, they were posting to the social media for the film, so when they were talking about boosting and posting, they were talking about posting on the It Ends With Us Instagram, It Ends With Us, Facebook page, and if they had, I think they have a TikTok putting out the content onto the social media associated with the film to amplify the voices of the victims and to get people discussing the film and a place to promote it. That's where they were posting and engaging the content. And then the second group of, smear campaign was happening in the press, and there was journalists and women's groups organizations that were shaming and degrading Blake for her flippant attitude domestic violence shelters, saying that the film was romanticizing domestic violence. There was letters from domestic violence shelters saying that it's not an accurate portrayal of domestic violence. The dangers of the way that they viewed and shaped Relay, which was the fault of Colleen Hoover because she wrote the book. And overwhelmingly, the tabloid press was what a jerk he was. And this, why aren't they following each other? And why isn't he any of the promotions? And then the articles started coming out. And he's abusive, and he's chauvinistic, and he's trying to control the scenes of abuse. And he doesn't care about Blake's point of view, and she deserved to have a voice. And so did Colleen, and she had to rewrite the script, demanded it. And yet, when Justin's side was given these Arctic, have all these tabloid reporters calling them up and saying, do you have a comment on this? Do you have a comment on? We're seeing this uptick in conversations online about you, which started in the beginning of August, before Melissa Nathan was ever hired. And 9 days before Jed ever joined the team, there were already dozens of negative articles out there about this before Jed ever came into the picture. But there were also dozens and dozens and dozens of articles painting Justin as an abuser. And when Justin's team responded, they simply would talk about he never wanted to make anyone feel bad. He always tried to keep everyone's point of view in mind. He spoke very kindly about Blake. When he was asked directly about her, he said he deferred to her a lot, that her hands were all over the film, yada yada. And then really, they would make mentions like, she changed the script, she got a cut of the film. It became a fight about creative differences where there were 2 separate cuts, and the both of them had different creative visions, and him feeling sidelined. And then there was people that came out of production that had nothing to do with Justin, that spoke to Hollywood Reporter and spoke to TMZ. And those people said that Blake's ego was a huge factor. There was issues on the set and that it was tense. People spoke out about how Blake was disconnected and disengaged. She was in and out and would go to her trailer and just sit in her trailer for hours. But there was no smearing of her in the press. Not by Melissa, not by Justin, not by Jamie, not by anyone with this film. But she did a lot of smearing through her publicist, Leslie, of him. And even if all of that back and forth went back and forth, none of them were talking about sexual harassment. And if Justin is responding to what she is saying and has a publicist that's responding to her allegations through her, what Leslie is telling them, do they not have a right to respond? Is that really retaliation when you bring it up? Retaliation would imply that something happened to you immediately following something you've done. And generally speaking, when it comes to sexual harassment, retaliation is not a digital online anonymous campaign that happens a year after a complaint is brought, which isn't really a formal complaint. A letter, a 17-point agreement was made almost a year later, then the retaliation happens. That doesn't even make sense. Retaliation would mean that you lose your job, you're demoted, you're alienated from other people on the cast, a negative consequence comes from you. Because you reported, so you reported, and then the next day, you don't have a job, you reported, and the next day, no one at work is talking to you, You reported, and suddenly your boss is more snidey to you and indifferent and angry. You reported, and people start spreading rumors about you the next day, not. And months later, them responding to you turning everyone against him and spreading a smear-see-smear campaign against him and using your digital army and your digital people. Leslie Sloan to spread rumors about him. For it to be retaliation, you have to have clean hands for someone to retaliate. You have to lose something. There has to be something to retaliate from. You also can't be engaging in part of it. And when you were bringing out the claims back then, you didn't say anything about sexual harassment. And even in your Vanzan Inc. lawsuit, you said nothing about sexual harassment. All you cared about was people spreading information about you, confidential information. Were you mad that people found out that there was another cut of the film? Were you mad that people found out that you basically stole a whole franchise from him and that you were after the sequel? Were you mad that Justin wouldn't give up the sequel? Were you mad that it was revealed by people that were on set, that you were difficult at times to deal with, and rude and condescending and abrupt, and you held up production? Is that the confidential information you're talking about? Because that's not retaliation. Retaliation would imply that it's being done because you brought out claims of sexual harassment. Retaliation would not be speaking the truth about what happened on set, and that's why her case is so flimsy. And so when she says to Megan, you know, this isn't even that bad, I've gone through way worse. I was just more upset about this smear campaign than don't sue for sexual harassment. So how much did you have to trump up your claims against him in order to bring this lawsuit? Because when you filed the Vanzan Inc. lawsuit to get these text messages that Megan used, you didn't say anything about sexual harassment? Nothing. So why then did Stephanie hand all that over to you? And then you sue for sexual harassment. If it wasn't about sexual harassment, maybe you guys were spreading a false allegation against him, stole a movie from him, threatened him, threatened the producers, threatened the family members, made them scared for their lives, intimidated witnesses, intimidated Taylor Swift, intimidated journalists, intimidated content creators. And now Blake Lively's team has taken over a subreddit called It Ends With Lawsuits. Last week, mods were kicked out and in, and a very neutral sub that had been heavily fact-based and focused on the case suddenly turned and became all pro-Lively propaganda. And anyone that didn't agree with her was called a misogynistic person that hates feminists. That's weird. It's almost like they're weaponizing feminism. And now that entire subreddit that has over 20,000 members is infected by pro-Lively, and people are getting kicked out, threads are getting deleted, content creators like me and others are being smeared in there, journalists are getting smeared in there that are that are reporting on this. Journalists that have been mentioned in the lawsuits are getting smeared in there. Justin and his team are getting smeared. But suddenly, everyone is very sympathetic to Blake in a subreddit that had never been pro-Lively. It was always just talking about the lawsuit. So who's running a smear campaign now makes you wonder, right? So Lively admitted that this wasn't that bad, and it's really not about what happened on the set. She's more upset that her reputation was shattered, and there's no accountability for what she might have done to contribute to her reputation being ruined. No, none. It wasn't that she disregarded victims of domestic violence. It wasn't that she was promoting alcohol. It wasn't that she said, grab your florals and friends. It wasn't that she told women that they need to basically get over it. And you are not what a man does to you. You are more than that. Okay, Blake, take your own advice. If you are more than what a man does to you, then let it go. How's that feel? You know that survivors really felt like you didn't see them when you said that Jana Kramer even wrote about it and said that domestic violence isn't something that is done to you. It's an abuse, and it leaves you traumatized. Your words were hurting people, your actions outraged people, and your continued narcissistic, malignant behavior is what keeps people talking about you. Please like and subscribe.